I was on a small vessel. Kevin, he probably talked about, if you heard him, he was on the Marginalize, which is the biggest ship that we had in the flotilla, the biggest passenger ship. About 560 people were on that boat. There were only 14 people on that boat. But we had prepared for this being a scenario, and so we put on our life vests and went out on deck. And because our boat was sailing so close to the Marginalize, I was able to see the beginnings of the attack on that ship. These, what we call zodiacs, which were like how they came up to this boat, the Spirit of Humanity, filled with masked, armed soldiers, coming up along the Marginalize and firing incessantly. I didn't know what kind of bullets they were firing, but just hearing shooting, and that I saw. So it was a full-on military assault on a civilian convoy. Our boat decided to take off. We hadn't intended to do that. The plan was we'd all stay together, we'd all help each other. But we decided that maybe if we can delay the boarding of our ship, at least until we could call out, we could radio someone, we could get message out that we're under attack, we would try to do that. So we sped off. Israeli, two Zodiacs chased us, and we were trying in the time that we were ahead of them to use our satellite phones to call out, to call our offices. Nothing got through. Our journalists were trying to use our satellite dish to email out their stories and their photos. Nothing could get out. And then after about 10 minutes, they took over our boat. They came up alongside, and we were using our bodies, putting them in the way to try to prevent them from getting on our boats and yelling at them to stay off. Our boat was American flag. We said, this is an American vessel, we're all civilians, keep your weapons off our boat. They just beat us down to get on the boat with their guns. They had an attack dog, and they just, as we scrambled to continue to put our bodies in the way so they wouldn't take over the boat to get where the captain was steering the ship, again, they just beat us down. They used tasers, they tased people, sound grenades, and they were firing paintball pellets. They fired at the face of one of my colleagues, so her face was bleeding, and took one of the first things they went after, our communication equipment, our cameras, our phones. Realizing this, I took my phone and shoved it down my pants. And after they finally got my hands tied behind my back and they dragged me to the front of the boat and put a sack over my head and pinned me down as a soldier went into my pants to get my phone. But they took away everything that we had and all the documentation we had. And it didn't take them very long to take over our boats. And then they steered it to our boat. They steered it to the Israeli port of Ashdod, and everyone was detained or under arrest, thrown in jail. Later we found out, people were injured on our boat, but in the end everyone was okay. On the Marginalize, 9 of our colleagues were killed, and 50 were injured. And we demanded an independent investigation. We want an independent international body to come in and to investigate. And we'll fully cooperate so that we can get to the truth of what happened. And we demanded actually that Israel release our cameras, our laptops, our communication equipment, because this was evidence that they were tampering with. But they didn't. And they refused to cooperate with any kind of international investigative body. Nevertheless, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations commissioned a panel to investigate. It was a 3-judge panel, and on this panel were renowned scholars of international law. One of them was a former prosecutor on the Special Court for Sierra Leone. One of them was a former judge on the International Criminal Court. And one of them was a former member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Israel wouldn't cooperate, so they weren't able to talk to any Israeli soldiers or commanders, but they did talk to a lot of witnesses. They interviewed over 110 witnesses and looked at all other available material and talked to human rights organizations and Israeli organizations, and in late September, September 23rd, 2010, they came out with their report. Some very important findings, 3 which I'll briefly state. The first one, a humanitarian crisis did exist in Gaza. So Israel was telling the world that there There's no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The people there aren't starving. We're letting in this humanitarian aid. Well, this fact-finding mission found that a humanitarian crisis did exist in Gaza. And because a humanitarian crisis existed in Gaza, Israel's blockade is unlawful and cannot be sustained in law no matter what the grounds for the blockade. Number two, our flotilla did not constitute an imminent threat to Israel, nor was it part of any kind of war effort against the state of Israel. And because we didn't constitute an imminent threat to Israel, intercepting our flotilla in international waters was unlawful. And number three, because intercepting the flotilla in international waters was unlawful, any force used by the Israeli armed forces to intercept our flotilla was unlawful. And they found that, well, what they said is they found enough evidence to prosecute for willful killing, torture, and willfully causing great bodily harm. And they asked that the people accountable be brought to justice. They found that 6 of the 9 people killed were most likely ex-people. One of them, the youngest volunteer to be killed, 19-year-old American citizen, his name is Dugan. He wanted to be a doctor. He's going to go to medical school after the summer. He was shot 5 times, 4 in the back. He wasn't attacking an Israeli soldier when he was shot and killed. And the last bullet to his face at point blank range. Right here. The report didn't go anywhere. We can almost say it's buried. Israel said they can conduct their own investigation, and they did. And they found that everything that they did was lawful. And so it might seem a little bit disheartening, you know, Israel's still getting away with these things, still acting with impunity. But there are a lot of positive things. Our Turkish counterparts launched complaints with the International Criminal Court and are asking the prosecutor to open an investigation. That might not happen, but we have lawyers in various countries that have also filed lawsuits against Israeli officials for attacking their own, for violations committed against their own citizens, and using universal jurisdiction to get them on war crimes if they should ever go into these countries. Spain has an active lawsuit, Greece, Sweden. Israeli officials constantly canceling their trips to the UK because they're afraid they'll get arrested. After our flotilla was hit, lots of artists canceled their appearances in Israel. Swedish dock workers refused to unload Israeli boats. South African dock workers refused to unload Israeli boats. In Oakland, California, there was a picket line, a protest, and the dock workers there did not cross that picket line to unload Israeli boats. And many more boycott and divestment initiatives picked up because people could see what Israel is doing is wrong, and so this action gave a boost to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And again, this is a civil society effort to hold Israel accountable. And we're planning Freedom Flotilla 2. So if Israel thought that they were going to break us with this massive use of force, that they were going to scare people away, they've done just the opposite. In about 2.5 months' time, we expect to take to the sea again, twice as big as we were last year. And that's what we're mobilizing for now. And the way that we can be twice as big, not just in the number of boats that we have or the number of volunteers that are on these boats, but in the number of people that are supporting the initiative, is if you help. If you help again, not by being on the boats, but by some way investing in this mission, whether it's having your child write a letter that will go on this boats destined for some child in Gaza, whether it's giving $1, whether it's making your community aware of why these boats are sailing. There's going to be a specific Canadian boat to Gaza that Canadians have been mobilizing for across the country. So hopefully that will that will get the attention of more Canadians. But we need to get people's attention even before we sail, because the eyes of the world watching is what will protect these boats. And we're going to sail not just for Gaza. You know, hopefully with the revolution in Egypt, maybe a more representative government will come to power. Maybe they'll open the border, refuse to cooperate with Israel, and open the Rafah border. I hope they do. But even if they did, Israel would still occupy Gaza. Israel would still control access to the sea. And not just for Gaza, but even the rest of the occupied territory. I don't want to separate Gaza from what's happening in the West Bank, where the wall continues to be built, settlements continue to be expanded. Just 3 days ago, Netanyahu announced that they're building, you know, they've approved 500 new structures in another settlement to be built. Homes being demolished, especially in Jerusalem, but also in other places, Israeli military operation in Palestinian towns. In Jerusalem, Israeli police officers are going into Palestinian homes at gunpoint in the middle of the night, kicking families out of their homes. So go to Silwan or go to HUWAIDA Arraf in Jerusalem, and you see Palestinian families living in tents across the road from what used to be their home, that now a Jewish family is living in, protected by armed guards. And the Israeli government thinks that's okay. And inside Israel, yeah, we're citizens. 1.2 million Palestinians are citizens of Israel, so I can walk around freely. You know, I can leave the country when I want, I can vote. But there are 35 laws on the books in Israel that discriminate against me because I'm not Jewish. And Palestinian villages inside Israel, 40 Palestinian villages, unrecognized. They pay taxes to the state of Israel, but they're unrecognized, so they don't get any services. They don't have water, they don't have electricity. Israel is wiping out Bedouin communities that are citizens of the state of Israel. Just 2 weeks ago, for the 18th time, demolished a village by the name of Auditorium, demolished their tents and their other structures that they're living in. These are citizens of Israel. So this, like I said in the beginning, this is all part of a colonial apartheid regime that needs to be dismantled. We need to push for human rights for everybody, not based on race, religion, or ethnicity. And so Gaza is not separate from that. And we sail not only for Gaza, but to confront all of these policies. And I'll go further, even to say that it's not just about Palestine. It's about what role do we have to play? What responsibility do we, citizens of the world, have when we see an injustice to take action if our governments won't? What are we doing every single day to create the world that we want to live in, and that we want our children to live in, and our children's children to live in? That's why we're going to take to the sea. So I hope you'll be with us. And I'm going to end, I'm way over time, and if I have, you've listened to me for like over an hour and a half, thank you. I thank you for your attention, for being here, for supporting us, and if you have questions in the like 15 minutes that we have left, I'll be happy to take them if I can.
Yeah, and simultaneously I'll pass around the bucket. Does anybody want to address that? Yes.
Here's your story. My First Nations, it's the same story. That's why I was playing with my sisters. That's all the friends over there. That's all familiar. But I want to know, and I've always wondered this, and I've never been able to really create how we can create an Indigenous Palestinian alliance. How we can support one another. That apartheid came from here. That's where apartheid started, these policies. How we can create an alliance and support one another. Because even some of the things that happen in this process are songs like you said and Brother Ahmed, they're talking about how sometimes where you get freedom still from people that are resisting. How do we build this relationship and help one another? It's like the day here did boycott some Israeli products and somebody put out there, oh, you say that. And I'm going, no, don't say that. They're domestic needs still support. I'm grateful that they're boycotting against Israel,
But while I